1842, a young Charles Dickens went on his first trip to America, to the United States. And like a lot of British travelers at this time, he felt the need to write about these experiences and the country he found on the other side of the Atlantic. And he published them in this case as his book, American Notes. Every single book that British travelers wrote about America received quite interesting responses from Americans themselves. And my favorite is this one from the Journal of the American Temperance Union, who pointed out that they were rather alarmed to discover that based on Dickens's writing, he may well have been drunk pretty much, as they say, for the entire trip. And when we actually start to read Dickens's American Notes, maybe they had a point. Because actually, when he starts the trip, as a lot of travelers did in Liverpool, here at the Adelphi Hotel, he recalled having a meal of cold punch with hock, champagne, and claret, all very conventional European spirits. This is very much a form of Western European drinking. On board the ship, he and his wife suffered from terrible seasickness, and his solution to this problem was hot brandy and water. Again, familiar intoxicants for a British audience. But then he arrived in America. And in particular, he arrived at a hotel in Boston, Tremont House, which was at the time a really high-tech modern hotel. I think the first in America to have indoor plumbing and all these kind of things. But it's here that Dickens found, and I think enjoyed, drinks of a rather different sort. He found himself in the bar, which he described as a large room with a stone floor where people stand and smoke and lounge about all the evening, dropping in and out as the humour takes them. There too, he says, the stranger is initiated into the mysteries of gin sling, cocktail, sangaree, mint julep, sherry cobbler, timber doodle, and other rare drinks. And I wanted to start with this because it captures some of the themes that I really want to talk about in my presentation today, which is all about the way in which people in Britain encountered America through its drinks and through what we would now term cocktails. The term cocktail has come to stand for this sort of wide variety of mixed drinks. At the time, cocktail was something more specific. And I love this little extract from Dickens because it captures some of the things I want to talk about. Because this was not just an encounter with a substance, with a drink, with an intoxicant. Dickens presents it, and I think it probably was for him, an encounter with American culture, and in particular its language. You'll note here that he doesn't actually tell us anything about these drinks. Their mysteries remain mysterious to us. I've put some recipes for them up here in case any of you want to enliven your lockdowns by mixing some authentic Dickensian American cocktails. But he doesn't give us that. All he gives us is the language. This is a linguistic encounter with American culture and its peculiar new slang that was emerging on the other side of the Atlantic. So it's a linguistic encounter, but it's also a humorous one, because I think Dickens here is very much inviting us to laugh, to chuckle, because these are funny names. These are peculiar terms. Timberdoodle, in particular, is a kind of a punchline to finish on here, isn't it? And interestingly, Timberdoodle, there is a great mystery. Nobody really knows what a Timberdoodle was. And I have a sneaking suspicion that Dickens might have invented it, simply plucked it out as a piece of American slang that he liked. He liked it so much that he named his dog after it. His dog was named Timber as well. So this sort of raises some questions for me. I guess, what did other British commentators and writers and consumers think of American cocktails? But also, when they were being invited to laugh at them, were they laughing at them or with them? And by extension, were they laughing at America or laughing with America? Because this is more than just an encounter with a drink. It's about two nations coming into contact with one another and trying to make sense of what that means. So those are the themes I want to explore in my paper today. And I want to just start by stressing something really important here, which is that when we think of cocktails, they almost exclusively now are framed as a product of the 1920s. We associate them very much with the Jazz Age, with that kind of post-war boom of American culture coming into Britain. And of course, that's typically understood as a kind of repudiation of the Victorian. Everything's new, it's electrified. It's all sort of Hollywood cinema, jazz, and all those kind of things that is supposedly sweeping away that which went before us. And when you find cocktail bars now, there's a real trend now, isn't there, for redecking them out in 1920s style or putting them behind secret speakeasy style doors. This is the hotel, American bar at Gleneagles Hotel in Scotland. But I really want to stress that the cocktail, in all the senses we understand it, is very much around in the 19th century. Not just the fact that people are mixing drinks, but they're giving them exotic and provocative names. They're preparing them in a theatrical way. All the culture that we associate perhaps more with the 1920s is very much there in the 19th century. And and firmly established, not just in America, but as we'll see, in Britain too. So before we get into the humour side of things, I just want to demonstrate to you the extent to which the Victorians, British Victorian people, consumed and thought about and engaged with the cocktail way earlier than we might think. So this is one of the earliest references I've been able to find so far. I've been digging around to see when do you first start being able to buy cocktails, or conspicuously American marketed cocktails in Britain. The earliest I found so far is 1844 here, where we see an advert in a Liverpool newspaper for the Brunswick, or Whiteman's Brunswick Hotel and Restaurant in Liverpool, which offered an ice house, which was peculiarly adapted for the immediate supply of sherry cobblers, mint juleps, and other American drinks. And it's no surprise, of course, that this is in Liverpool, right? The gateway to the Atlantic, a space where American culture often arrived first. But there are loads of other examples. So this is in 1844, just 2 years after Dickens's trip. Drinks that he described as rare and mysterious were now on the British people's doorsteps. But there are tons of other examples. Here's another one from another Liverpool restaurant, Morris's Merchant's Dining Room. This time, though, look at how many they've got on offer. Sherry cobblers, mint juleps, brandy and gin, smashes and cocktails, eggnogs, eye openers, flashes of lightning, hailstorms, thunderbolts, gum ticklers, neck twisters, and so on, in endless variety, as they say. And again, they're being very much marketed as American drinks. They're not simply drinks that have been imported and then anglicized. Part of the pleasure of them is about encountering America. But there are loads of others. Before long, you start seeing American drinks for sale in London, and in particular, in pleasure gardens. Here's the Royal Gardens in Vauxhall in 1849, offering, quote, an American bowling saloon with all the American drinks. And not to be outdone, Cremorne Gardens, one of the other great pleasure gardens of Victorian London, was offering a gigantic bowling saloon, which is now open. And all the American drinks are served in the highest perfection at the new and splendid buffet. In other words, a night out in Victorian London, going to one of the real pleasure spots, an American drink, a cocktail, is a thing you would encounter from the 1840s onwards. And it's not just a brief fashion, a thing that was in season. You know, so many things were in the Victorian era for, you know, a month. Actually, we can see here in 1874, we have a comic cartoon of two rather fast-looking ladies with their ankles on show, smoking cigarettes and saying, now, way to look sharp and bring sherry cobblers for two. There is an enduring association of American drinks with women on the town, perhaps having a little bit more fun than the male artists were comfortable with. But American drinks appear in all sorts of other places. In the cider cellars in London, these are the foreigners of the music hall. We see here again American drinks on offer. Here, this is my absolute favourite one. At the King's Head pub in London, there was a wide range of American drinks fixed up, they said, by a live Yankee. And I found out more about this when the King's Head soon went bust afterwards. But again, the thing that the newspapers picked up on when they were saying this pub has gone under was this was the place that sells American drinks. And again, we can see the place of the American drink being embedded here into the kind of Victorian man-about town's evening routine of getting a chop in the city. Here they are buying American drinks from rather glamorous barmaids at one of the city's pubs. To the point where actually by 1881, we start to see phrases like the now inevitable American bar, that these were no longer one-offs, but to be found almost everywhere in the pleasure landscape of London nightlife. Here, for instance, we see them at the Alhambra Theatre, where the latest novelties in American drinks may be tested by the curious. So they're all over the place. In fact, yeah, just one more example. They also start to appear as a major feature at Victorian exhibitions. These were these kind of big summer shows that would appear every year and offer, you know, usually on a different theme. And they would often have American bars. And if you just skim down this, you will see that this article is basically just a long list of all the exotically named drinks that you could buy here at the Fisheries exhibition. Here's another example. This is at a horticultural exhibition in 1892, where two ladies have gathered to see a show. It's weird, it was a horticultural exhibition, but Buffalo Bill was performing there as well in his return to London. But anyway, the first lady says, let's have another American drink, Flora. Good gracious, dear, we've had 8. Yeah, well, if we don't, we shall have to give up our seats and there's not another in the place to be had. So again, you can see the American drink is sort of part of this leisure culture. So if you didn't want to go out and get a drink, you could also buy guides to mixing American drinks at home, which were published in London, often endorsed by famous barmen who'd made their name at some of these exhibitions or in prominent city taverns. And some of these guides are actually in the Wellcome collection too. So in other words, the cocktail was a really pervasive part of Victorian life, way more than we might think. So then the question, I suppose, is, well, what's the significance of this? And how might these drinks, these encounters with American drinks, have shaped wider British encounters with America and the way that they came to think of American culture? Well, I think we can unpack this in a couple of ways. The first is to go back to something that I showed you a minute ago. It's this article here from the Fisheries exhibition. And I think I said at the time when I first showed it to you that the format of this article really doesn't describe the content of these drinks. We're not getting rapturous reviews of their taste and texture, their colors, or how drunk they're going to get you. For the most part, they're just lists of names. And one of the most common ways in which cocktails appeared in newspapers, apart from adverts for places you might go and buy them, were things like this. And you would be amazed at how many of these kind of articles appeared in Victorian newspapers that were simply lists, just lists of, here are some funny names for drinks that are sold in America. And this is quite a short one. I've seen ones, 2 to 3 times longer than this, and with quite peculiar cocktails named on them. And what this suggests to me, again, it's something I mentioned in connection with Dickens at the start, is that people were not simply taking pleasure from the taste of these cocktails, but from this sort of, by drinking in the language of America as well, its culture. They're curious about life on the other side of the Atlantic, and there is something fun and playful in playing around with its slang in Britain. And I could do a whole sort of longer lecture on this, but playing with American slang was, again, a real pastime in Victorian Britain. There are tons of slang terms that come from America, get imported into Britain, and then become the sort of the latest thing in fashionable slang around London. And there was a real pleasure in doing that. They weren't simply laughing at America. They were enjoying playing with this sort of new language emerging across the pond. It was, as the John O'Groats Journal put it in 1859, America, they said, is a wonderful country for silly names, and even the beverages are not exempt from this precious nomenclature. And then we get a whole list of them again. Now, I think it's fair to say that there's some interesting kind of cultural politics at work here in terms of, a wonderful country for silly names. They might be enjoying American drinks, but it's also a bit of a put down, a sense that America is a silly place. And in fact, you can see this is an example of the kind of the other response to American drinks, which is to see them as an example of America's vulgar manners. This was from a writer who was stationed as a consul over in America for a while, so saw them firsthand. But who said that, the bad taste in giving vulgar names to their articles of food or refreshment is an obvious defect in American manners and is certainly unpleasing to a foreign ear. To him, maybe, but then we've got to remember that practically every pub in London is selling these things as well, right? So really, how unpleasant was this to many Victorians? But again, you can see here how the cocktail has been used as a way to position European refinement, as this writer puts it, with American vulgarity, that we wouldn't in Britain name our drinks in this kind of way. The other way in which these cocktails are used in this way is by British writers. So there's quite a lot of literature produced in the 19th century by British writers who try to write American characters and try to write it in dialect, who try to sort of figure out, okay, what would a man from Kentucky sound like? And inevitably, the kind of thing they do is incredibly hackneyed and over the top. But one of the ways they signal that is often by having the character order a cocktail. And you can kind of, I won't read out this full example today, but you can kind of see what I mean, hopefully, where we have this this loquacious Kentuckian who is talking at length about about his character, but in the process is wanting a timberdoodle. Again, the phrase timberdoodle appears more often in British accounts of America than it does in any kind of American culture, as far as I've been able to find. I think it feels like a British invention, a caricature of what an American drink would be called. But also, it was also used by comedians in a slightly more, I would say, affectionate way, not always as a way to mark out American manners. This is one of my favorite examples. This is a music hall song by Arthur Lloyd from 1875. Lloyd's like one of the great music hall singers of the era, one of the most famous. And he has an entire song all about American drinks, which again, I won't sing to you because I think probably nobody needs to hear that. But this is a story where he, towards the end of a night out when he's already pretty drunk, wanders into the American bar at the Café Riche, starts to flirt with the barmaid. And then the chorus, which you'll kind of see, after the first verse there, is basically just a list of cocktails: a stone fence, a rattlesnake, a renovator, locomotive, pick me up or private smile by Jove is worth a fiver, a Colleen Bourne, a lady's blush, a cocktail of a flash of lightning, julep smashes sangarees, or else a corpse reviver. Corpse reviver is a particularly famous cocktail that the British people seem to love playing around with. He later goes on to use these cocktails to flirt with the barmaid. Pick me up would be great if you would knock me down, I think he says at some point. So you can see how there's a kind of cheeky playfulness, which is again a quality that British writers often associated with America, an irreverence that these cocktails are allowing British comedians to play around with. Again, not in a way that mocks America, but in a way that seems to take pleasure, revel in these kind of peculiar names. And there are lots of others. Lots of other comic artists and writers used cocktails as a way to explore differences in British and American culture. So here's a classic one from the sketch 1901, where we have an impatient British customer saying, "Now, waiter, look sharp with that cocktail." To which the waiter says, "Excuse me, sir, but are you a strike me dead or a corpse reviver?" And again, the point of this joke is the juxtaposition of the peculiar modern American way of drinking with a slightly out of step, old-fashioned Britishness that is slightly struggling to deal with this, with these new forms of drinking. Here's another one. So we have again at a club, Podgkinson, determined to be off somewhere, says, "Alfred, just bring me an atlas." To which the butler says, with his mind running on American drinks, "Very sorry, sir, but we're out of it." So you can see there's a kind of comedy to be had here with the juxtaposition of American culture and British manners, which again, and the British people don't necessarily come out of this as superior, but as befuddled. Here's another particular, a couple of other examples. Here's another one. This came out in the wake of the Dean of Bangor giving a speech, basically saying that tea drinking was dangerous, to which Judy magazine's response was to depict two ladies not talking about tea, as they normally would, but actually about how they're going to drink a whole range of American cocktails. So one lady offers the other one some Leave It to Me or a Corpse Reviver, and she says, "Oh no, nothing, dear. I've got a square meal and a stone fence waiting for me when I get back." And again, this sort of idea that British and American drinking habits were somehow different, and this was a way of measuring national culture or cultural difference, appears in a wide range of other cartoons here, where we see British and American people talking about the merits of drinking standing up. Finally, this is one of my favorites. This comes from Illustrated Chips. This is a classic example of the British person slightly struggling to cope with modern American culture. Here we have a young man taking his girl to the industrial exhibition where they order some American drinks, but he's never seen anything like this before, doesn't know how to drink through a straw, and immediately starts trying to eat it. This was a really recurring joke. I think this must have happened to some people because this seems to be a comic trope from the time period. So this is sort of a whole range of ways, I guess, in which the cocktail is a way to explore the comic side of Anglo-American relations. I just want to finish by saying that one of the real associations of the cocktail, and of course of America, is with modernity. Here we have the Sporting Gazette in 1867 talking about that they live in a finely cultivated age, in an era of electric telegraphs, tubular bridges, and American drinks. And in fact, this was the way in which American drinks were often talked about as being new, the latest, the most fashionable. In the way that you might talk about a new Parisian hat, you would talk about the latest cocktails. So here we have, again, adverts, the latest American drinks, not the tastiest, not the old favorites, the latest, the newest. And this reminds me a lot of another thing I explore a lot in my work, which is American humor and the way it was imported into Britain. These are all the columns of American jokes printed in the Hampshire Telegraph, branded very much as American imports, all framed as new, as fresh, as exciting, and as modern. And that's very much, I think, the way in which America was often sold to British people, sometimes perceived in a threatening way, sometimes dismissed as being vulgar and new, but in many cases enjoyed, drunk in, imbibed as exciting and fresh. Way before the 1920s, millions of people in Britain were starting to consume forms of American popular culture, and they were enjoying it. And that, I think, is very much kind of captured. I love this quote from the Leeds Mercury about humor, but says, "American jokes are refreshing to the jaded brain that is accustomed to wade through the flavorless, six-water grog kind of wit of the English comic journals, where if the labored joke is dissected, it's found to be but a new corpus built on the skeleton of an old Joe Miller." Joe Miller, of course, a famous jest book from the 18th century. I'll skip over this one. But the point I guess I'm making here is that, one, cocktails were being consumed in Britain way before we might think, that people were enjoying them, enjoying in the process American culture, its humor, its slang, its character, and that I suppose these drinks, these encounters with America were not simply alcoholic. They're not just about getting intoxicated. They were about consuming a nation and making sense of its culture in the process. Thanks very much.